You enter a dark room that smells like rot and sickness. The air is thick and hard to breathe. People are lying on narrow beds, their skin covered in lesions and sores. Some are moaning in pain. Others are too weak to make any sound at all. You move between the beds, checking pulses, wiping faces, changing soiled sheets. You know what they have. Everyone knows. It is written on their bodies in pustules and scabs. It is one of the deadliest diseases in human history, and you are surrounded by it. You touch their skin. You breathe the same air. You eat your meals in the next room. And every single day, you wonder if today is the day you become infected, if today is the day the disease moves from them to you. There is no cure, no treatment that works. Once you catch it, your survival is just luck. But you keep working because someone has to. Because if you leave, they will die alone. And because you are paid to be here, in this room, with death all around you. This was the reality in Europe and America throughout the 1700s and 1800s, a time when infectious diseases killed millions and medicine had almost no power to stop them. Smallpox was one of the worst. It spread easily through the air, through touch, through contaminated objects. It killed roughly 30% of everyone who caught it. Those who survived were often left blind, scarred, or disabled. Entire communities were wiped out during outbreaks. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Families abandoned their sick relatives out of fear. But someone still had to care for the dying. Smallpox nurses were hired by hospitals, by wealthy families, and by local governments to tend to patients no one else would go near. The pay was higher than most jobs available to women at the time. But there was a reason for that. The mortality rate among smallpox nurses was staggering. Most did not survive more than a few years in the job, but desperate women took the work anyway because they had no other options. Her name was Margaret. She was 28 years old when she became a smallpox nurse. She had been widowed 3 years earlier when her husband died in a factory accident. She had 2 young children and no family willing to help her. She had tried to find work as a housemaid, a laundress, anything that would let her keep her children fed. But jobs for single mothers were almost impossible to find, and the ones that existed paid so little she could not afford rent. A hospital administrator approached her after she inquired about cleaning work. He told her they needed nurses for the smallpox ward. The pay was 3 times what she could earn anywhere else. Margaret asked why it paid so much. He did not lie to her. He said most nurses did not last long. The disease was too dangerous. But if she was willing, the position was hers. Margaret thought about her children. She thought about the eviction notice she had received that week. She thought about the fact that she had no other choices. She said yes. She started the next day. The smallpox ward was located in a separate building behind the main hospital. It was isolated to prevent the disease from spreading. Margaret walked through the door and immediately understood why the previous nurse had quit. There were 30 patients crammed into a space meant for 15. The smell was overwhelming. Smallpox caused pustules to form all over the body, and when those pustules ruptured, they released fluid and pus. The bedding was stained. The floors were filthy. Some patients were delirious with fever. Others were too weak to move. Margaret was given a bucket of water, some rags, and basic instructions. Keep the patients as comfortable as possible. Change their bedding when necessary. Give them water. Report any deaths. That was it. There was no treatment, no medicine that worked. She was there to watch them die and make sure they did not die completely alone. Margaret started with the closest bed. A man in his 40s, his face so covered in lesions she could barely see his features. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored. She dipped a rag in water and gently wiped his forehead. His skin was burning hot. She moved to the next bed. A woman, younger, maybe 20, crying quietly. Her hands were covered in sores, and she could not stop scratching them. Margaret took her hands and held them still. The woman looked at her with desperate, terrified eyes. Margaret did not know what to say. There was nothing to say. She just stayed there, holding the woman's hands, until the scratching stopped. She moved through the ward, bed by bed, hour after hour. Some patients asked for water. Some asked her to write letters to their families. Others just stared at the ceiling, waiting. By the end of her first day, Margaret's hands were raw from washing and wringing out rags. Her back ached from bending over beds, and she could not stop thinking about the fact that she had touched every single patient. She had breathed the same air they were breathing. The disease was in that room, and now it was on her skin, in her lungs, everywhere. She went home that night and scrubbed herself until her skin was red. She kept her distance from her children, even though it broke her heart. She could not risk bringing the disease home. But she had no way of knowing if she was already infected. Smallpox had an incubation period of up to 2 weeks. She could feel fine for days and still be carrying it. Every morning, she checked her skin for signs of pustules. Every time she felt warm, she wondered if it was fever starting. The fear never left. It sat in the back of her mind constantly, a quiet terror that followed her everywhere. But she kept going to work because she had no choice. Her children needed to eat. Her rent needed to be paid. So she walked into that ward every single day, knowing she might not walk out. Margaret stopped talking about her job. When people asked what she did, she lied. She said she worked at a laundry. If they knew the truth, they would not let her near them. Parents would keep their children away. Shopkeepers would refuse to serve her. Her landlord would evict her out of fear she was spreading disease. So she kept it secret, but the isolation was crushing. She had no one to talk to about what she was seeing every day, no one to share the weight of watching person after person die in agony. She started having nightmares. She would dream she was covered in pustules, that her children were sick, that she was trapped in the ward forever. She would wake up gasping, her heart racing, unable to get the images out of her head. During the day, she moved through her work like a machine. She stopped letting herself feel anything. If she allowed herself to care, to see the patients as people, she would not be able to function. So she became numb, and that numbness began to spread into the rest of her life. Imagine doing that. Imagine walking into a room full of dying people every single day, knowing that simply being there could kill you. Imagine touching infected skin, breathing infected air, and going home to your children wondering if you just signed their death sentence. Could you do it? And if you were desperate enough to try, how long could you last before the fear consumed you? Margaret watched people die every single day. Sometimes it was quick. A patient would spike a fever, slip into unconsciousness, and stop breathing within hours. Other times it was slow and agonizing. The pustules would spread, covering every inch of skin, even inside the mouth and throat. Patients would choke, unable to swallow, unable to speak, just suffering in silence until their bodies gave out. One of the worst cases Margaret ever saw was a child, no older than 8. The girl had been abandoned at the hospital by her family. No one came to visit her. No one wrote her letters. She died alone, calling for her mother, and Margaret was the only person there to hold her hand. That night, Margaret went home and broke down. She could not stop crying. She could not stop seeing the girl's face. But the next morning, she went back to work because there was no one else to do it. The disease did not just kill patients. It killed nurses regularly. Margaret had been working in the ward for 6 months when the nurse in the adjacent room became infected. The woman had seemed fine one day, and then suddenly she had a fever. Within 24 hours, pustules appeared. Within a week, she was dead. The hospital replaced her immediately, as if she had never existed. Margaret attended the burial. There were only 3 other people there. No family. No recognition. Just a quick burial in a pauper's cemetery, and then back to work. Margaret realized that was her future. If she got infected, she would die the same way, alone, forgotten, buried in an unmarked grave, and no one would care because she was just a smallpox nurse. But here is what most people do not realize. Smallpox nurses were sometimes deliberately infected to make them immune. There was a procedure called variolation, where material from a smallpox pustule was introduced into a healthy person through a small cut. The idea was that a controlled infection would be less severe and provide immunity. Some hospitals required their nurses to undergo variolation before they started working. Margaret was not given that option. Her hospital did not practice variolation, so she worked without any protection at all. But in places where variolation was used, nurses were intentionally made sick. Some survived and gained immunity. Others developed full-blown smallpox and died. It was a gamble, and the nurses had no choice. If they refused, they did not get the job. So they allowed themselves to be infected, hoping they would be among the lucky ones who survived. Think about that for a moment. Imagine being told that to work a job, you first have to be deliberately infected with a deadly disease. Imagine accepting that because you need the money that badly. Imagine rolling the dice with your own life just for the chance to earn a wage. Does that change how you think about desperation? Does it make you wonder what you would do in the same situation? Most smallpox nurses did not last more than 3 years. The constant exposure eventually caught up with them. Some developed partial immunity after repeated low-level infections, but that immunity was not reliable. Others simply got lucky for a while, then their luck ran out. Margaret lasted 2 years. That was longer than many, but by the end, she was exhausted in a way that sleep could not fix. She had watched hundreds of people die. She had held hands, wiped faces, changed sheets, and tried to offer comfort when there was none to give. She had lived in constant fear of infection, And she had done it all alone, with no support, no recognition, and no guarantee she would survive another day. Margaret became infected in the early spring. She woke up one morning with a headache and a fever. She knew immediately what it was. She had seen the symptoms too many times. Within 2 days, the pustules appeared. Her landlord found out and evicted her. Her children were taken by a church charity. She was brought back to the hospital, to the same ward where she had worked, and placed in one of the beds she had spent 2 years tending. The nurse who had replaced her did not know Margaret had worked there. She just saw another dying patient. Margaret tried to speak, to explain, but her throat was too swollen. She could not form words. She spent her final days in the same room where she had watched so many others die. And when she finally stopped breathing, they buried her in the same pauper's cemetery where the other nurse had been buried. No marker, no record, just another forgotten casualty. Society needed people like Margaret to contain the spread of disease. Someone had to care for the infected. Someone had to isolate them, clean up after them, and stay with them until they died. If no one did that work, the disease would spread faster and kill more people. Margaret's work saved lives by preventing further infections. But she paid for it with her own life, and society did not acknowledge that sacrifice. There were no memorials for smallpox nurses, no public recognition of their service. They were seen as desperate women taking dangerous work, not as heroes preventing epidemics. They worked in the shadows, died in the shadows, and were buried in the shadows. But without them, the death toll from smallpox would have been even higher. The job itself eventually disappeared. Vaccination replaced variolation. Public health improved. Smallpox was eventually eradicated, but that took more than a century. The women who worked as smallpox nurses during the worst years had no idea that one day the disease would be gone. They just knew that people were dying and someone had to help them. So they did. And they died doing it. Margaret was one of thousands of women who took that job and never came home. Their names are not in history books. Their graves are unmarked. But they stood between society and a plague, and they held the line until it killed them. Margaret is gone now. Her children were raised by strangers. Her name was never recorded in any official document. She is just one more forgotten worker who died so that others could live. But her story is not unique. There were countless others like her, women who took the most dangerous job available because they had no other options. Women who walked into rooms full of death every single day and stayed there until the disease took them too. And if you think smallpox nursing was the most dangerous job in history, you would be wrong. There were others, jobs that exposed workers to even more deadly threats, jobs that killed faster and left even less behind. And some of those jobs still exist today in forms we do not think about.